5, though, is on the agenda for this week. And we're going to be looking at a lesson that is entitled Unprepared for the Judgment of God. It's based upon the story that we find there about a king by the name of Belshazzar. And before we start looking at Daniel 5, I want to just kind of interject some thoughts here as we begin. And this is one of those rulers in world history that has kind of puzzled historians and people who are looking to establish a successive line of kings in the Babylonian Empire. And a lot of times people look at the Bible and they say, well, why don't we have more information about this particular king? Or why don't we have some of the background? Or why don't we have their family lineage or anything like that? And I want to remind you, when you read the book of Daniel, it's not, God didn't write this book so we just have a history of everything that happened to his people while they were in Babylonian captivity. In fact, if you know anything, if you've studied a little bit about the book of Daniel, you'll know that as far as time chronology, that's a very little to no interest of Daniel whenever he wrote this book. In other words, everything that you read of in the book of Daniel doesn't happen in chronological order. And a lot of the books in the Bible are like that. And the reason is simply because it's not a timeline. God didn't give us these books so we'd have a timeline by which we could look at history and say, well, this is when so-and-so did this, and then next in line was this, and then the next event that happened was this. What it is a record of is, it's a record of God's dealing with the kingdoms of this world that posed a threat to the kingdom that he was planning to establish. And so that's really an outline of the book of Daniel itself. That's why when you read chapter 5, you just read about this guy Belshazzar, and it's just like poof, he's on the scene. There's no introduction to him. There's no biographical information that tells us anything about him. There's no explanation of where he falls in the line of these Babylonian kings. But God's dealings with this man, he appears in one chapter and he disappears in the very same chapter. And so you can imagine that why is Belshazzar in here? Well, it's not to set up this historical lines of the kings of Babylonia, but it is to establish this idea of how God interacts and deals with threats to his particular kingdom. And I want us to think about Belshazzar in contrast to Nebuchadnezzar that we've been studying about the last couple of weeks. We studied last week about how God was remarkably patient with Nebuchadnezzar. He talked about how judgment was coming upon him, but he waited an entire year and gave Nebuchadnezzar a chance to change before he brought that judgment down upon him. That's not the way it happens in this chapter. In fact, we're going to read about how Belshazzar was very speedily and very suddenly cut off from his kingdom. And the kingdom was taken away from him permanently, whereas the kingdom was taken away from Nebuchadnezzar for a period of time until he learned a very valuable lesson. I was reminded of the words of the wise man in Proverbs chapter 6. In Proverbs chapter 6, he's writing about the wicked person. In verse 15, he says this about the wicked man. He says, "Therefore his calamity shall come suddenly. Suddenly he shall be broken without remedy." Think about that as it applies to the world of the wicked. Very suddenly, a day is going to come and God is going to do something that's just going to blow their world apart. It's going to shatter it into many pieces. And you think about Belshazzar here, that's what happened to him. The day of God's judgment came upon him very suddenly. And in an instant, that kingdom that he had was destroyed beyond any hope of repair or any recovery. And one of the things that I'm going to emphasize as we go through this chapter, I think is a good lesson for us, is it's a really dangerous and scary situation for us to be in when we know that God is gracious and yet we don't respond to what we know. And Belshazzar was one of those people who knew that. That was a lesson that he had learned long ago, but yet he failed to respond to that lesson. And so, if I were to think about it, I was kind of trying to boil it down to one idea and one main idea and one lesson. But the story of Belshazzar to me is that he was an unteachable person. Didn't matter what God did, didn't matter what God said, he just never learned anything that he was supposed to learn. And what happened because of that is it left him unprepared when the judgment of God came upon him. And that's what I want us to think about this morning. We're going to look at some things that left him unprepared for God's judgment, and of course what we can learn from that in our lesson this morning. And then, Lord willing, tonight we'll talk a little bit more about the idea of judgment being weighed in the balances of God. But the first thing that I want to point out is what left him unprepared for the judgment of God is that he was irresponsible with the privileges that God gave him. And you see that in a number of ways here in Daniel chapter 5. First of all, if you look at verse 1, it simply states this. It says, Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords. You know, the first thing that we read about as we're introduced to this guy is basically a royal party that he's throwing. And understand the idea of a royal party, the idea of these ancient nobles throwing these extravagant parties, it's not foreign to the Bible, and it's not foreign to history. History tells us that at many points in times, these great rulers would throw these extravagant parties to basically try to impress all the people of their kingdom, and if they had any visitors, to also invite them too. This is one of the biggest parties that you'll read about, though. He invited, the Bible says, 1,000 of his lords. So I want you to think about the enormity, the size of this party that he's throwing here. And what we want to emphasize is not so much the size, although it was a big party by any means and any standards, but really the purpose that he threw it. Why did Belshazzar throw this party? Why did he invite 1,000 of his lords? And as you're studying and you're reading, what you'll find is he was just like Nebuchadnezzar was in the beginning. He was a very selfish individual. He's a very arrogant individual. And so think about why would he do this? And I think as you'll read with me through this chapter and study it, what we figure out is, you know, this was a public display of his own inflated ego. I mean, he's a lot like Nebuchadnezzar was. He wanted everybody to be impressed with how powerful of a person he was and how great of a person he was, and this great kingdom that he was in charge of, and everything that he could do for them. I think that's further illustrated if you look in verse 2. We're not going to read it at this time, but who comes along with him to this party? Well, it's a public display. As I mentioned, it's all his wives are present with him. Not only does he bring all his beautiful wives for everybody to see and admire, but he also brings along all of his concubines too. And so he's showing in this party, look at all these women, these beautiful women that I have. Look at all this great wine that I have that we can drink. Look at all the fun and security that I can provide for you. And so you have this idea of why in the world did he throw this party like many ancient nobles? It was to try to impress the people by publicly putting on display everything that they had. Now, what's interesting is if you go down to the end of this chapter in verses 30 and 31, the Bible tells us this information. I know we're kind of fast forwarding here, but hopefully you've studied the whole story itself before. If you haven't, you can go home, you can read a little bit on your own. But it tells us in verse 30, in that night, okay, the very night that this feast happened, the very night that Belshazzar sees the handwriting on the wall, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now, what's interesting to me is when you go back and you study history, there are numerous Babylonian historians that say as this party was going on, that the Medes and the Persians had the city of Babylon under siege. And you have to stop and you have to think about what is the likelihood of that entire army making it there at that point in time, in that short amount of time, being unnoticed. Well, they would have spotted that army a mile away. They would have known that they were coming. But numerous Babylonian historians say they were already there. And in fact, they were already camped around the city itself. They were besieging the city. You remember that I often mention the idea that the strength of these ancient cities were their walls. They had great defenses, they had great gates, and basically the only way that you could bring down a fortified city, you had to wait them out. You had to cut off all their supplies. You had to wait till they ran out of supplies. And when they did, eventually, if they were smart, they would give up. And so imagine here this army of the Medes and the Persians encamped around the city of Babylon here. But do you think the Babylonians were scared? Not a bit. In fact, think about the implications of this. Belshazzar is so unconcerned about what's going on out here. He says, hey, let's have a royal party. I mean, how many kings in their right mind would think that way when their city was under siege? There's no king that should think that way. He should be concerned about, any possibility that this city or this empire might be taken away. But it shows you a little bit about his arrogance. It shows you a little bit about his pride. And there's a couple reasons, I think, why these Babylonian kings were so proud and so arrogant in their thinking. They thought that there was no way that the city of Babylon could ever be taken by another army. And from a purely physical perspective, they were about right. I mean, the city of Babylon had massive walls. They had these lookout towers where they could spy the enemy coming, a mile away. They had these bronze gates that were impenetrable to any other armies. And so they had all these defenses that were set up. And you might think, well, if you cut the supplies off, then you could wait them out. Well, the Euphrates River ran through Babylon. And so you couldn't stop the Euphrates River, and so they had a constant supply of water through the city no matter what you did. And some people have estimated, and I don't know, I'm not a historian or archaeologist or anything like that, but they've said that some of these storehouses that were built in the kingdom of Babylon and the city of Babylon, they had enough food that they could survive for 20 years. So in their minds, how is anybody going to take us? You're going to have the patience to surround my city for 20 years and wait us out? It's not going to happen. And so think about how unconcerned he is in this situation. Think about his arrogance in throwing this party. And basically, he has this mindset and this attitude, and this is what he's trying to portray to his people who might have been thinking about it, who might have been worried about it. He's saying, listen, this isn't anything to worry about. I'll take care of you. I'll protect you. You don't have to worry about anything bad happening to you. Let's just have fun and let's party tonight. And so that's basically the mindset behind it. Well, the second thing that I want to emphasize is not only the motive behind this feast that he's throwing, which I pointed out was selfish in nature. It was basically a display of his power, very arrogant in his thinking, but the manner of behavior that took place at this party. And when you read about what was happening, it was disgraceful behavior by God's standard. It was foolish behavior by the standard of God. Notice in verse 1. So he makes this great feast to 1,000 of his lords. And this is an interesting statement, the way it's translated. And he drank wine, notice this, before the 1,000. I think sometimes we read that phrase and we kind of just pass over it and say, well, he's at this party drinking. But there's more to it than just the face value here. In other words, he's in front of all these people. Okay, he's before all these people. He's in the forefront of this picture. All eyes, all these 1,000 lords are fastened on Belshazzar, which is exactly what he wants. He wants all this recognition and, showing off his women and everything like that. And so all these eyes are staring at him. And with all these eyes staring at him and watching him, what does he do? Well, in our language, he begins to drink himself under the table. Okay, so here he is. He's going to put on this massive display of how great of a man and how powerful of a man that he is. He's going to demonstrate his bravado, so to speak, in front of all of these people. He wants them to be impressed with him. He was going to show them what a man he was. He was going to show them that he was a person who could hold his liquor. And so he starts doing this in front of all these people. Now, I want you to stop and I want you to think about the ways of the world. Isn't that how men are today? I mean, if you want to impress in the world today, if you want to impress another male, what do? You show them how much you can drink. You show them how much you can hold, how you can outlast all these other people. And so with all these eyes staring at him, this is what he begins to do. Well, how disgraceful and how foolish can a person be? we're talking about this idea. These are the things that left him unprepared for the judgment of God. He was behaving in a very foolish manner. He was doing disgraceful things. The Bible tells us, actually Jesus himself said this in Matthew chapter 24. He's talking about the difference between a faithful servant and an evil or a wicked servant. If you go down to Matthew 24 to about verse 47, he's talking about the evil servant here. He says, assuredly, I say to you that he will make him, or verse 48, but if that evil servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants, and to eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that servant will come at a day when he is not looking for him, and at an hour that he is not aware, and will cut him in two and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. See, the point that I want to make from this is the Bible teaches to us the principle of stewardship. Okay, a lot of times God gives us all these great blessings in this life. Everything that we have has been given to us by God. And they're not just given to us so we can go out here and selfishly and arrogantly do whatever we want to do with it. They're not given to us so that we can go out here and act like a fool and do disgraceful things with these blessings that God has given to us. The principle of stewardship is this. One day, God is coming back, and He's going to look at what He has given us, and He's going to see what we've done with that, and He's going to hold us accountable for it. And if we're irresponsible with the privileges that He's given to us, we're going to be just like Belshazzar. We're going to be unprepared for the judgment of God. So we have to be responsible with our privileges. The second thing that I want to point out that left him unprepared for the judgment of God is that he committed blasphemy against the God of heaven and earth. And there's a couple of ways that you see this in this story. First of all, it's in the unrestrained drinking that was taking place at this party itself. Notice in verse 2 here of Daniel chapter 5. It says, Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem. And the king and his princes, his wives, and the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Now, I want to emphasize, I don't want you to get the wrong impression from this point, unrestrained drinking, that as long as you restrain yourself while you're drinking, you're okay. Okay, that's not the point that I'm trying to make. But I do want to emphasize that the liquor was flowing freely at this party. And one of the discussions that has often taken place within the religious realm is, how much, if any, alcohol can a Christian drink? Well, I always tell people, sometimes people come to me and they ask this question, and I do it in a very, I do it with a good faith in my mind. And this is the challenge that I put forth to them. Usually those people are the people who want to prove that it's okay to drink as long as you don't get drunk. Okay, so here's my challenge to them. Find one verse in the Bible that says something good about wine or intoxicating drink outside of medicinal purposes. Find one verse. Now there are times when in the Bible it's mentioned it had a time and a place. It was good medicine in that day and in that age. But find a place in the Bible outside of that context or that realm where it is mentioned in a positive way. And you know what? You won't find it. It's not there within the Scriptures. And so what that tells me is this: if I'm not drinking it for medicinal purposes, then I'm probably not drinking it for the right reasons. Well, we don't have to wonder why Belshazzar was drinking it. It wasn't for medicinal purposes, and it wasn't for that reason with anybody else who was at his party. But you can imagine, okay, with the amount of alcohol that's being consumed here, you can imagine how quickly the party starts going downhill. And so here's what he decides. And you can almost, again, picture this in your mind. He's wanting to put on a display for all the people. And so here's what he says. He says, you can almost hear the arrogance in his voice. Go get the Jewish holy vessels. Go get those vessels that we took out of the temple of God when we captured the city of Jerusalem and captured the nation of Israel. Go get those gold and those silver cups. And here's what we're going to do with them. We're going to drink our wine out of them. Now, the action, I think, also symbolized kind of the current situation that was going on. If it was indeed the case that this other army was camped right outside of the city of Babylon, I think the message that he would have been trying to send is, let's show everybody, let's remind everybody what happens to the enemies of Babylon. Okay, let's remind them where everybody who withstood us is today. Bring out those Jewish holy vessels. And here's what we're going to do with these sacred vessels. We're going to drink wine out of them. Well, the book of Proverbs is another book that deals with the idea of the dangers of wine and intoxicating drink. Proverbs chapter 23 is an especially good chapter toward the end of the chapter itself. But here's one of the statements that's found within that chapter in verse 33. And it says there, the person who drinks wine, thine eyes shall behold strange women, the King James Version says, and thine heart shall utter perverse things. Found it kind of interesting as I was studying. I always learn, or usually I learn something new whenever I study, even scriptures that I think I've studied time and time again and know well. But actually that word women is not in the original language. What he's talking about is, he says, your eyes will behold strange things. You'll see things that you don't normally see. And then he says, thine heart shall utter perverse things. You'll say things that you don't normally say. And what he's indicating to us is what we already know from science, is that alcohol, it affects your vision and it affects your speech. So here's the Bible talking to us about this idea of the dangers, of these particular drinks. And so the warning I think we should get from it is this: stay away from wild parties. Okay, that's one of the good lessons to take away. Now somebody might say, well, what's a wild party, preacher? Well, if they're drinking, it's a wild party. I'll tell you that. There were dangers that were associated with this. Why is it dangerous? Because doing these things dulls the senses. It clouds your ability to reason. It's a proven fact. It causes people to lower their standards. It will weaken our morals. It'll leave the door wide open for irrational thinking and bad decisions. And as the wise man described here, people will often see things and say things that they don't do during the normal course of life when consuming these products. And one of the things that I always try to emphasize to our young people, I know sometimes our young people say, well, I can go to these parties where alcohol is present, but I'm not going to drink. Listen, the danger isn't just in you consuming the alcohol, it's in other people consuming it too. Because when you're around people whose vision is clouded and who are thinking irrationally because they're under effects of some kind of drug, that's not a safe situation to be in. And so this is the party that we're reading about here at the Babylonian palace. Unrestrained drinking that's taking place. Well, what did it cause? It caused this man to blaspheme God. And the way that he blasphemed God was in the use of these holy vessels. He took these things that were supposed to be sacred and holy to God. He made the holy common or unclean. And notice in verse 3 what happens. Then they brought out the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was at Jerusalem. And the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them. Now I want you to stop, and I kind of mentioned at the beginning of this lesson that Belshazzar, in my opinion, was an unteachable person. Did he know where these vessels were from? Absolutely. He knew the history behind these vessels. He knew that they had come from the temple of the Lord. He knew that his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had brought these over whenever Jerusalem was put under siege by the Babylonian Empire. He knew everything. He knew the history behind these vessels themselves. So why did he choose to drink wine out? And the answer is this. He was trying to publicly make this display that the king of Babylon and the empire of Babylon is stronger than anyone and anything else. You don't have anything to worry about. Yeah, there may be an army out here surrounding our city, but they're going to give up in the long run. What do we do with those who are our enemies? We conquer them, we take their treasures, We bring them back to our empire, and we use them as we see fit. Now, the problem is this, that in doing those things, and with that arrogant attitude, Belshazzar was actually mocking the God of heaven and earth. He was saying that the Babylonian king is stronger than the God of heaven and earth. The Babylonian empire is bigger and stronger than the God of heaven and earth. And so God takes this as a very personal insult. There are a lot of lessons that we, or a lot of different routes, I guess, that we could pursue in this particular study. But a couple of things come to mind. First of all, in Ezekiel chapter 44 and verse 23, one of the things, when God tells the priest what their job was, one of the things that he tells them was their job. They were to teach the people, my people, God says, the difference between holy and profane. When you go back and you look at the law of Moses, there were certain things that were considered holy. And there were other things that were just considered common, ordinary, everyday things. One of the things that was considered holy were the vessels of the temple of God. Okay, these vessels had been designed by God. The blueprint had been given to Moses. They were made and designed to be used in worship to God. They were holy vessels. They weren't common everyday vessels that you used out here in the world. They were set apart. They were separated solely for the purpose of worshiping and serving God. And so one of the things that the priest had to do is they had to teach the people the difference between something that's holy and the difference between something that's just a common, ordinary day occurrence. The Hebrew writer talked about this concept of holy things and common things in Hebrews 10 and verse 29. He was actually writing to Christians when he said this, but he said, "Of how much sorer punishment, suppose ye, shall he be thought worthy, who hath trodden underfoot the Son of God?" Notice this, "and hath counted the blood of the covenant wherewith he was sanctified an unholy thing." Now, I want you to stop and consider what the Hebrew writer is talking about here. He's talking about taking the blood of Christ for granted. He's talking about this special thing, this thing that is different from everything else, just counting it as something common and cheap and ordinary. We can be guilty of that as Christians, can't we? We can be guilty of taking the blood of Christ for granted and saying, well, if I do this, it's no big thing. The blood of Christ has me covered, right? What are we doing to the blood of Christ? We're cheapening the sacrifice that Jesus made. We're counting this as just an ordinary, common day object that has been given to us. The blood of Christ is holy. It's different. It's set apart. It's separate from anything else, any other blood that we might encounter in this life. And so it's a precious gift from God. And that's the way that we need to view it. Not as something common, not as something ordinary, but something very special and something very precious. Well, that's what Belshazzar didn't do with these holy vessels of the temple. And so by using them in a very common way, and I might also emphasizing, not only using them in a common way, to him it was just a cup. That's all it was, something to put some liquid in and drink. But it was also an instrument of wickedness. Think about that. He was using it to drink himself into a drunken stupor. To take this holy vessel of God that was supposed to be used to worship God and to serve Him and to magnify His name and to use it as an instrument of wickedness, that was something that God took very personally. And so he committed blasphemy against God by unrestrained drinking and also by making these holy things common. And that left him unprepared when the judgment of God came upon him. The last thing that I want to mention in our study of Daniel 5, at least this morning, one of the other things that left him unprepared for the judgment of God was he was far removed from reality. He didn't have a clue of what was really happening and really going on. And, you know, there are a lot of people in the world today who are exactly in that same boat. They're so far spiritually removed from the reality of what's going on that they don't have the good sense to see things right before their eyes. And so one of the things that I'll point out is he was, spiritually speaking, he was blind and he was dead. Notice in verse 4, they drank wine, they praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. it wasn't this drunken state that Belshazzar was in that made him lose sight of reality. He lost sight of reality a long time ago. But he had no sense. He had absolutely no inkling of the impending judgment of God that was coming upon him. Not only did he not see the judgment of God coming upon him, he didn't see the next world power coming and conquering him and killing him and taking away his kingdom that night. He was blind to the reality of the things that were happening around him. He was living, in his mind, he was living in a dream world. He was living in a fairy tale, we might say. And he was the spotlight of this dream world, and so he felt like everything was going like it should. When God wrote about the destruction of his people in the book of Jeremiah chapter 5 and verse 21, where he had Jeremiah write about it, he's writing here about the capture and the destruction of Jerusalem. And he says this in verse 21. He says, "Hear now this, O foolish people, and without understanding, which have eyes and see not, which have ears and hear not." You know, Jesus used that same illustration in the New Testament about a certain group of people. They had eyes, but they couldn't see. They had ears, but they didn't hear. They had a heart, but they couldn't understand. And I want us to stop and think about this idea or this point this morning. Why did God give us eyes, and why did God give us ears? He gave us eyes so we could see what was going on. He gave us ears so we could hear. He gave us a heart so we could understand. And the point that I want to make is sometimes we lose sight, in the world that we live in, we lose sight of the reality of what's really going on. We lose sight of the big picture, we might say, that God is in control, and in the end, things are going to be okay, and they're all going to work out for the betterment of those who love the Lord. But we have eyes, but sometimes we just can't see that fact. We have ears, but sometimes, no matter how many people might tell us, or how many times we might read it in the Bible, we just fail to hear the message that God has for us. No, the reality is God is in control. Judgment is coming one day. Heaven and hell are real things. We're in need of a Savior. All those things are very real. But yet Belshazzar was not able to see that. The last thing that I'll emphasize is part of what showed his far removal from reality is the fact that not only the path that he was traveling, but the fact that he was leading other people down that very same path. In fact, if you go back to verse 4, you read about how they drank the wine. They praised the gods of gold, silver, brass, iron, wood, and stone. Why did this entire party happen? The reason is because Belshazzar wanted it to happen. He was the one who was leading this party. Why was the wine being consumed at the party? It's because that's what Belshazzar wanted to happen. And so he commanded for the wine to be brought out. The party was his idea. The wine was his idea. Drinking out of the holy vessels was his idea. Praising the gods of gold and silver and wood and stone and iron, that was all his idea too. He was the person who was responsible for leading all these other people down the same path. In Matthew chapter 18 and verse 6, you're probably all familiar with this verse. But Jesus made this statement. He says this, "Whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and that he were drowned in the depths of the sea." I think I've mentioned this before, but it's interesting when you go back and you study the Greek language. There were two different words that were used for millstone. The first one was the word mule, and it was basically a handheld millstone. Now, if you don't know what a millstone was, that's the way that they processed their grain crop in that day and age. They would go and they would harvest the grain, and they would basically put it between two hard rocks, and they would grind it. They would grind the chaff, the outer layer off that wheat, and then that would leave the wheat seed, which they would use. And so there was one that was kind of a handheld millstone. You know, sometimes it might take two people, but usually one person. You had a big rock, and then you had another rock with a stick that was fastened in the middle, and you just took your arm, you just rotated that rock around on the wheat seed until the chaff was separated from the kernel. But then there was another type of millstone. And usually it consisted of a solid floor that was usually 4 to 5 feet in diameter and a rock that was usually 2 to 3 feet across. And it took animals to move this millstone. They would again attach it to a stick. The animal would pull it around in a circle. They'd just be able to grind more wheat. But it's interesting when you read about this, guess which millstone Jesus is talking about being hanged on our neck here? It's not the rock, okay? It's not the one that one person can take and move around with their hand. It's the big one that the mule or the animal has to pull around. If I cause somebody to go astray, if I lead somebody astray, Jesus says it was better for that millstone to be hung, chained to my neck, and me to be thrown into the depths of the sea than to face God in judgment. I want you to think about that. Now, I've said this before, there are some ways, when you think about death, there are some ways that if I get to choose, I would not want to go that way. I don't want to be burned by fire. That would be one of those things you say, not too good of a fate, right? I don't want to be buried alive. That would be another one that I'm claustrophobic, so I just I can't imagine that. But one of the other ones is drowning. Think about, you think about how you go and you think, how bad of a way to go would that be? Jesus said there's something worse. And that's to face God in judgment having led somebody astray. It would be better to drown in the depths of the sea than to appear before God in judgment having led somebody astray. Our actions and our words affect other people either positively or negatively. We're either leading people toward God or we're leading people away from God. But our actions and our words are doing one or the other. Belshazzar was leading people away from God, and that left him unprepared for judgment. You read this story, and we just barely covered the first couple verses. I hope you come back tonight. We'll talk a little bit more about it. But Belshazzar's world was soon turned upside down when the fingers of a man wrote a series of words on the wall. The sad part is, you read this story, the sad part is he should have learned from his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar. He shouldn't have had to go through all those things. But he was an unteachable person. That's more of a commentary upon the condition of his heart than the precepts of God. But he's one of those people that no matter what God did, he could just never get the message across to him. And so in a moment, in a millisecond, Belshazzar is made conscious of the judgment of God in Daniel 5. The lesson for us this morning is this: don't be that unteachable person. God's judgment is coming one day. Don't be unprepared. Don't be like Belshazzar. We have responsibilities that come with our privileges. God gives us these blessings, but they're not just so we can selfishly and arrogantly do whatever we want to do with them. They're not just so we can fulfill the lust of our flesh, or they're not so we can go out and act like a fool and be disgraceful in our behavior toward God. We have a responsibility with these privileges that have been given to us. The second thing is, don't be blaspheming God. How? By consuming alcohol. Don't put something in our body that's going to dull our senses, that's going to affect our ability to reason, that's going to leave doors wide open for irrational thinking and bad decisions. Don't make holy things common. Don't act like these special gifts and privileges that God has given to us are no big deal. They're very special things. They should be treasured and cherished above all other things that we have. Don't allow ourselves to be removed from reality. Don't be spiritually blind and deaf. God has given us eyes and ears for a reason. He wants us to see. He wants us to hear. And don't lead other people astray. Don't cause them to be lost. We're either leading people toward God or we're leading them away from Him. And if we're leading them away from Him, the fate that we're going to face is not a good one. Maybe there's one here this morning who is